Please welcome our next speaker, Sunny Mattoon, a senior implementation consultant. Today, she will be presenting her session, I've turned on MRP, now what? Please stick around after Sunny's session for a live Q&A.
Hi, my name is Sunny Mattoon, and I first want to say thank you to everyone who voted for my session. I'm super excited to be here at DynamicsCon presenting MRP and what do I do now to everybody who's here. The first thing I do want to point out is that we also have a chat, and it will be up through my whole session. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will be attending this, and then we're going to have a live Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions at all, we can answer them all at the end, and then you'll also give you my email address if you're more comfortable with that. So let's go ahead and get started. The session we're going to be looking at today is you've already turned on MRP, and now what? Hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions about what the users want to get to for Windows, how to respond to the MRP suggestions, and then also how to troubleshoot if you don't understand what MRP is telling you or why it's telling you. So first, who am I? I have been working with Dynamics GP for a very long time. I've been a participator in the different community groups and doing some boot camps and some training sessions. I am super passionate about manufacturing. I work a lot with business intelligence, and on a personal note, I love to camp, I love to eat, and I love to travel. Okay, so in our agenda, the first thing we're going to talk about is how to see what MRP is telling you to make and to buy. We're also going to look at how to see what the exceptions are. What are the move in, move out, and cancel suggestions? We're going to look at some deep dive windows to get more information about specific items and the relationships between supply and demand. Then we're going to troubleshoot the results. We're going to look at what different transactions are doing and how MRP interprets them. And then we're going to look at the master records and what kind of instructions they're giving to MRP. And then finally, and most important, I'm going to give you some tips for success. Okay, so let's get started. First, what is MRP telling me to do? What should I buy? When we're getting into MRP to lay the groundwork, I want to talk about high-level windows and deep dive windows. So high-level windows are going to give you an overview. Tell me everything I'm supposed to buy inside a time frame. Show me everything we're supposed to make for the next 3 weeks. And then you have the deep dive windows where you're pulling up a specific item, maybe a specific time frame at a specific site, maybe even a specific MRP suggestion, and getting all the information around that particular thing. So there's a little bit of a whiplash sometimes as we're working with this, as you go high-level overview, deep dive, back up to high level. We're going to start with the high-level views. Show me everything that I need to buy inside a certain time frame. So the best window to work with on this one is called the request resolution window, and it's found in your purchasing module under your transactions. When you open up the window, you have quite a few options for how you can get MRP to give you the info. The first one is you can put in an end date. You can also choose how you want to sort, whether you want to sort all the demand by an item or all the recommendations by date. As you scroll down, you can see everything that MRP thinks you ought to buy with required dates and release dates. And then when you find something and you get into the area where you want to work, you can edit the quantity that MRP is telling you if for some reason it doesn't look right or you have more information than you had when MRP ran. You can change the requested date to something that makes sense, and then select your vendor. Then when you select the Select Vendor button, you get a pop-up window that shows you all of the approved suppliers for the item, and it also tells you what date that they need to order it by based on the lead time that you have for that item-vendor relationship. You select the one that's important, you click on it, you click the Select button, and then it's going to add that over to a shopping cart on the right for that vendor. You go to another item and click Select, and you'll note a little star because they have a primary vendor. And you click Select, and again, it starts adding to that shopping cart. When you're ready to create the purchase orders, you can go down to the bottom and you have two buttons. One is create and one is attach. Create will create a new PO for everything you have in the shopping cart. It'll be a different PO per vendor, and it'll be different line items for every item that you've selected. If you click the attach button, it will prompt you to attach it to an existing purchase order. And that's usually only used when you have blanket POs and you want to attach to the blanket as a new release. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click the attach or the create. It's going to put little C's up there so I know what it's about to happen, and I'll click OK. And now the system will create purchase orders for me over in the purchase order processing module for these items, for these vendors, and then I can move forward with my normal purchasing activity. So it's very smooth, and it's a nice little window to help you automate a little bit that creation of the purchase orders. So let's move on. What should I make? Again, there's another window. It's under the manufacturing module, and this is a good place to see all of the recommendations of what MRP wants you to make. There are other windows where we can see this information, but this is the one that seems to work the best, and it's the smoothest and gives you the most options. So once we get into the edit MO status, you're probably used to this window, because this, if you're working with manufacturing, is where you would mass release manufacturing orders. And this is where you could mass close the manufacturing orders when you get to the end of the week or the end of the month and you want to move them off to history and recognize the variances. What we're going to look at today is how to work with the MRP orders. So up at the top of the window, we have a show MRP planned orders, and I'm going to click that box. I can choose the status that I want them to be created as, and I can also add them to CRP if I'm using that module. Can use the ranges to restrict, so I can say, well, I just want to see what we're making over the next week or two. I can also go down and edit the planner ID if I've organized my items by type, and then click redisplay. And now I get all the different items that MRP wants me to order. I can sort them, I can show in high detail. I can also edit the quantity if it makes sense. And then once I'm happy, I just check the little boxes to tell MRP and the manufacturing order what I'm going to do, click process, and then it'll go ahead and create those manufacturing orders for me in the status I chose. And then I can move forward into our normal process, which might be releasing the manufacturing orders, printing paperwork, doing whatever it is that you need to do in your regular process. So those are two of the major windows that you work with when you're dealing with MRP. What am I going to buy? What am I going to make? But you might say, well, what if there are exceptions? Shouldn't I check those first? What if MRP is telling me to expedite something? So I need to do a move in. Maybe I need to do a move out. And what's likely is that you're going to want to pay attention to that information before you start cutting new purchase orders or creating new manufacturing orders. So usually I recommend that you start with this area, which is show me my move in, move out recommendations. And once I make some decisions around there, then I'll go over and look at what you're telling me to make and buy, because you're assuming, MRP, that this, I've already done what you told me to do here, and then I'm responding and moving forward. So this window is a great window. I think of it as a Swiss Army knife. It is a high-level overview window, which we're going to see right now. We're going to see all of the MRP suggestions for move-in, move-outs, and cancels. It's also a deep dive window, which we're going to see a little bit later on when we're looking up some information that's specific to an item for a specific time frame. When we're using it for the exceptions in this high-level view, we're going to go in and we're going to work with the different quantities that you see in this window. So the first thing that we'll note is that when we click into it, there are like 30 different ways that you can slice and dice the MRP information. We're going to be clicking on MRP suggestions so that we're just looking at the move in, move out, and cancels. And I can put in specific ranges. So if I'm a buyer or a planner and I want to focus on my own information, I can look at that, class ID, any of the other things. When I clicked refresh and I got my sort, I can come in and put any information that helps me interpret all of this data. And then I can scroll down and see all of the different things that MRP thinks that I should be paying attention to. A couple of notes, you'll see icons on these windows and they are not always super clear. The exclamation point usually indicates that there's something going on that you need to respond to quickly. So it could be as simple as the release is past due. It could also just mean the release is in the next 7 days. So the exclamation point isn't always something that needs to be alarming. The other thing we'll note is that MRP has little, for the cancels, we note that there's a cancel type. So CAN is its indicator for cancel. And then it has like a little do not enter sign. If we keep scrolling down, we'll see some of the recommendations for a move in, and those are MVIs. And we can see on that one, if I scroll down to it, I've got 4 that it wants me to move in, and I can see it's showing a move between supply and demand with the dates, just as its own way to indicate that it's going to take away the supply on the old date, and it's going to put in supply on the new date. Now, this is a super helpful window, but I might not want to see all of the information. Maybe I'm the planner. Maybe I'm the buyer. So if we click on the next tab, which is the statuses and types, we can see that you can include or exclude different types of manufacturing orders or purchase orders. And in this case, I'm just going to take away the purchase orders entirely because I'm not a buyer. If I click on the next tab, you can see that there are certain suggestions that you can include or exclude. And then most importantly, you can save this as a query so that you don't have to click through and redo this every time you want to look at it, because this should be a daily window. In this case, I'm going to come over to the inquiry name and I'm just going to type in what I want to call it. So I'm going to call it manufacturing exceptions. And once I put in manufacturing exceptions and I click save, query is going to be saved for my user ID. So anytime I come into this window, I can use the magnifying glass next to query and see all of my queries and pull up the data I want, click refresh, and I'll have exactly what I want to look at right away. So this is a really great window to start out with because it lets you know what are the things that MRP is alarmed about, and then you can make decisions on whether or not you can expedite or cancel, and then make your future buying decisions or manufacturing decisions around that information. Okay, so now let's start looking at some deep dives. As you're looking at your make and buys, or you're looking at your move-ins, you're going to be asking, well, what is going on with this item? And one of my favorite windows to do this is in the workbench. So this is also under manufacturing inquiry, and in the MRP section, you'll see several of these windows. The top 3 are my favorites. Workbench is one that shows you for a specific item and a specific site exactly what's going on, and it shows you that information in buckets of time. I can look at it in daily buckets, weekly buckets, or monthly buckets, and right now we're looking at it in a monthly bucket. The first area shows me the gross requirements, so this would show me all of my demand. And then as I move down, I see a projected balance. So that shows me what it thinks it's going to have on hand at the end of that time period. So end of the day, end of the week, whatever I'm looking at. And then in between there, I see scheduled and planned receipts. So scheduled receipts are anything that's firmed or released. And then planned could be an open MO, a new purchase order, and it's also the MRP recommendations of what you should make or buy. And then underneath that is the MRP suggestions, and we can see that we have that -4 and the +4, where it's doing an attempt of moving the supply that I have in one bucket to an earlier bucket. The other bucket I want you to keep note of is that past due. So anything that is in the past, anything that has a date that's before the date MRP ran, is going to be all lumped together as if it happened yesterday. Because MRP doesn't recognize whether or not something is 6 months old, or maybe it's just sitting on the dock and it hasn't been received yet. The past is the past. And if it's a valid transaction that MRP is looking at, it's going to act like it essentially has already happened and you just haven't recorded it in the system, which can be a little bit dangerous if you're thinking about maintaining those transaction dates. And that's something we're going to look at in a little bit when we get into the troubleshooting section. So in here, one of the things I want to look at is how this window interacts with our Swiss Army knife window. So as I come in here, I'm putting in a specific item and a site, and I'm looking at my different quantities, and these are all hyperlinks, and the hyperlinks take us to that quantity query window. So if I want to get all the information that's leading up to a projected balance, I can just come into the field that's important, so projected balance for this one, and it's back to my Swiss Army knife, and it's opened it up. This time, the MRP query is ATP total. So that's how it's referring to that projected available balance. And it's showing me my on-hand inventory, an MPO, so that's an MRP suggested purchase order, and an MVI, which is my MRP move-in that we're seeing. So by opening that window from here, we've been able to use that window for a deep dive query on a specific item in a specific time frame. Then at the bottom, you can see the different buckets of time. So I've got months and weeks, and that helps me control how I'm looking at it. Okay, so let's do another deep dive. And that is, why is MRP telling me to buy this or telling me to make this? This is another one of my favorites, and it's called pegging inquiry. And it is a deep dive for an item at a site, and you're actually going to drill into one of the MRP suggestions and understand what's driving that suggestion. And it allows you to do a thing called pegging, which pegs up through the different demand, so you get all the way up to the source of the MRP demand that kind of is driving the bus. So for this one, when we've worked with the window, you really are doing it for a specific item that you need more info on. So I'm going to put in an item number that I have a question about, and then I'm going to put in the site that I want to see. And maybe MRP is telling me to buy a large quantity or a quantity with timing that doesn't make sense. So as I scroll through here, I can see a couple things that I just want to point out. The first thing is you have the type. So the type, like a PK, is just an abbreviation for a pick list. And it has the manufacturing order that's there for that. Anytime you see a doc number that's the MRP doc number, that means it's an MRP recommendation. And so MRP will also put a little M in front of it. So I have an MPO is a purchase order from MRP. An MPK is a pick list that MRP is forecasting I'm going to need. An MMO is a manufacturing order coming out of MRP. So as I scroll through here, I'm looking over on my right-hand side, and I can also see whether or not the thing I'm looking at is a source of supply or is it a source of demand. So as we roll our way down, we find the thing that looks mysterious to us, and you double click it, and that's going to fill in the tree view at the bottom, which is the key place we want to be, because we can expand the tree view. And it's telling me that for this item, I have order point that it's trying to acknowledge. I also have some MPKs. So this item is on some pick lists that MRP has calculated. Well, of course I want to know why. So I click the plus sign. And as I do that, it expands out to the next view where I see, oh, well, this item is on a pick list because there is an MRP planned MO. And I can see the parent item right above it. So this item, solder, goes into CBA 100, and MRP is telling me that I need to make some of that. Well, it also has a plus sign, so I can click on it, and I can see it has order point, and it's on a pick list. And as I go through here and just keep drilling down to see why, I can get all the way through the bills of material, essentially to get to the top level item. And in this case, that top level item is that 100 XLG. And I can see down here that it has an MRP recognized demand for 70, and it's on an unmet sales forecast. So that forecast was driving MRP to suggest a manufacturing order, and where it drove itself over the bill of material to find the information, and then it kept moving down because it's calculating supply and demand for all of those different items. And I can see all of that kind of brought together in the pegging window. So a really, really great deep dive window to show you what MRP is thinking about. Okay, well, as you're looking at this stuff, then sometimes you're going to see suggestions that don't make sense. You're going to get into troubleshooting mode, and the question is where do you start? So your first response will probably be, as you get into MRP, that doesn't look right. A lot of times you're planning separately from GP, and you're introducing MRP into a new environment, and you want to fine-tune it really so that it works in the best way possible. As you're bringing in your years of experience in planning and you're looking at these recommendations from MRP, you're going to know if something looks out of pattern. So we're seeing dates, we're seeing quantities, and something doesn't look right. And so the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what story are my transactions telling MRP? The MRP is scraping dates and quantity out of all of your existing purchase orders, manufacturing orders, and sales orders, and it's doing math based on that information. So what story is MRP gleaning out of those transactions? And then once it recognizes that it has some sort of problem and it needs to plan for supply, then it goes to the master records to figure out how to plan for supply. So the next thing you need to ask is, well, what instructions are my items giving MRP? Because the two together are really important to understand how they're working, because MRP is a lot like handing a calculator to a 4-year-old. And as you hand over the calculator and instruct, punch in these numbers and punch in these buttons and hear more numbers, you're going to get results with zero thought over whether or not those results make sense. The math will be right. It just might not be the math that you want to see. So let's look at purchase orders. The first thing you're going to ask is, when is this item due to arrive? And then the second thing that MRP is going to ask is, well, what is the quantity that's coming in? So we want to look at what the date is that MRP is looking at. If I click on the item and I want to see the date that MRP sees, then I'm going to go to the little blue arrow to get into the details. And the date that MRP looks at is the current promise date under the vendor side. It is not looking at your required date. The current promise date is the one that you need to maintain. So that one's super key. The other question is, what quantity? So if I click on my little eye, I can see that for this order of 1,000, I've already received 995, but because I haven't received it all, the purchase order has 5 on back order remaining to ship. And MRP is looking at that, and it sees that quantity as supply that it's going to expect to come in on that vendor promise date. Now, that's probably fine. If you're not going to get the 5 in, then you can go in and you can cancel it on the purchase order, and then MRP will recognize that that's not going to happen anymore. That can be kind of a manual process. And there are items, especially something that you order by the pound, for example, where you might commonly not get exactly the same amount that you ordered. So if you order 1,000 pounds of something and you get 995, you're probably not going to get a little box with 5 more pounds in it. So there is a setting that we can set in the system for the items that behave that way, where you don't have to keep manually going back and clicking cancel on the quantity to accommodate that. So what we want to look at is we're going to go to the item, and I'm going to go to the item card, and then I'm going to use the go to, and I'm going to go to the purchasing information for that item. And down at the bottom right, there's a checkbox called shortage and a tolerance. And if I put it in, then I'm essentially telling the system that I have a tolerance to be short for this item up to 5%. And if I receive something in short, when I invoice match for that amount, as long as it's within 2%, 5%, whatever the number is that makes sense for you, to go ahead and close that PO out so that the users don't have to maintain and remember to cancel and everything. So it's a really good way to just tighten that up a little bit so that you don't have a weird accumulation of a bunch of old back orders that are confusing MRP. Okay, so the sales orders. And the main question on this one is, what is the date of the demand? There is a requested ship date in the header area. So if we click on the blue arrow, we see requested ship date, but MRP doesn't look there. MRP is site specific and item specific. So let's expand the line item. There is the requested ship date at the line item level, and that's where MRP is going to go. You might have an additional thing going on, and so what I'd like, as you get to your systems, to go to the additional window, and then you're going to pull down the menu for manufacturing sales item detail. And you'll see in this one, you actually have another window. You might be familiar with this window, but if you've never dug into it, take a peek, because you have something called an in-house due date. And it's likely to be the same as your line item requested date, but you have to control for that. That little nugget is where MRP is probably getting your date. So if you're interacting with MRP and it keeps telling you that the sale is at the wrong time and you've looked at the line item and it seems right, try the additional and click in there and see if your in-house due date is really the date that you want MRP to be looking at. because this is where it's going to go. As you're working with your users and they go in and change the requested ship date, then you'll want them to be aware of this so that they're updating this date at the same time. So let's look at what that looks like. So the users need to be aware of that in-house due date. So if they come down here and they change the requested ship date, a window may pop up that asks you if you want to. And yes, yes, yes is your answer. So the in-house due date is what MRP is looking at, and you want your users to be aware of that so that if there are any issues, they make sure that they're maintaining that. When they go into the sales line item and modify the date, there is a pop-up asking that they want to update the in-house due date. And if you see this window, which you may not, but if it pops up, then the answer is yes every time, so that the MRP side of things is seeing the changes that you're making in the system. So I'm going to back up and come back. And now when I go into the sales line item detail, my in-house due date is updated with what I put on the line item. So that means that when MRP runs, it's running against the date that you intend it to run against. Okay, a couple quick notes about manufacturing orders. Manufacturing orders are a source of supply and demand. They're a source of supply for the item that's being made, and the key fields we want to keep an eye on are on the MO entry window. I have the item number I'm making, I have the site that the finished goods are going to be posted to, and then I have the due date. Obviously, the quantity that you're making, these are what MRP is going to look at. If you're looking at the pick list, which is a source of demand, you have the components, you have the required date, and then you have the site that they're being issued from. MRP is going to look at these two things together, and it's going to use that to inform what it thinks is going on and whether or not you're going to have that item here in time to be met. It makes sense for a moment, though, to talk about the sites and this date information on the pick list. Where do those come from? When you're putting in your manufacturing order and you click Build Pick List, it's going over to get your bill of material. If you haven't really done much with your bill of material, then it's likely that the required date is just the start date for your MO. And the issue from site is coming from that main page on your MO, which is the draw inventory from site. And that gets filled in with your scheduling preference. So your scheduling preference drives that, and then that drives your pick list. However, you can influence those fields based on what you're doing with your bill of material. So let's look at how that happens. In my bill of material, I have an issue from site and I have a lead time offset. So by default, these might be blank. And in that case, it's basing all of its information right off of the MO. But if I do have an issue from site, then this is going to be what the manufacturing order uses when it builds the pick list. So I can really drive where I want a particular item to be pulled from when it's being made on this parent. The lead time offset I can use if I want to have it build a pick list where the required date is maybe a few days before the MO start date, or maybe it comes as an offset from the end date. Maybe it's not due until a few days before the end. In any case, I can use this if I want to, so that when you drive your pick list information into the manufacturing order, it's showing up with the way that you want to. But the main thing on troubleshooting is just know what's happening behind the scenes so that if it's not what you want, you know where to go and change it. The other thing that's key about the bill of material and this information is if MRP sees that you need something that's a make item and you don't have the supply, there's not an MO already scheduled, then it's going to suggest an MO. And as soon as it does that, it goes directly to the bill of material to see what's the dependent demand from that MO. As it's exploding out that bill of material, it's looking here to see what component do I need, in what quantity, and what site is that component demand. And the key thing to keep remembering about MRP is that the supply and the demand need to be in the same site. So if it's driving demand for my site warehouse, then I need to have on-hand inventory at my site warehouse, or I need to have a purchase order that is pointing to site warehouse so that MRP knows that it should net those numbers together. Okay, so now we get into what is your item telling MRP about itself. It's gone through the transactions, you're comfortable with your dates and your quantities, and now MRP is putting together information and it says, hey, I think you need more of this. The item resource planning window gives it instructions on how to behave. And before I dive into this, I'm just going to plant one more seed that if you have questions, please use the chat, because I will be joining you online live after the session to answer any questions that I can. Okay, so in the item resource planning window, I have default values and I have site-specific values. MRP is super site-specific. So the first thing is make sure that if you go through this window, go to the site ID that you're working with and make sure that your values there are the ones that you want MRP to look at, not the ones in the default value, not the ones on a different site. So make sure you're on the right site. Other things to troubleshoot: is my checkbox calculate MRP for this item? Is that checked? Down at your order policy, you need to have an order policy that MRP recognizes. So those two things have to be checked and set in a way that MRP is going to see the item. Then it's looking at the information underneath it to make decisions about how to create the order in a way that's actionable for you. So if you're getting recommendations that aren't actionable, so for instance, if you order something and you always get it in cases of 50, and you want MRP to suggest a purchase order for 50, and you keep getting PO's recommendations for 37, then you want to come to this window and interact with your minimums and your multiples so that MRP knows how to give you the right information and it's actionable without having to override it every time. The next key thing to keep in mind, though, is that this isn't the only place MRP might be looking. Does your item have a primary vendor? The primary vendor is set on the item quantity window, and it is site specific. And if you have a primary vendor, then MRP goes somewhere else to find some of that vendor information. So some of the key fields we see here are repeats of the item resource planning. We have the min, the max, the multiple, the lead time. MRP is going to come to the item supplier relationship if it's a primary to get that data. So you want your users to be really familiar with that little idea, because if they're going through and updating lead times or information, you want to make sure they're doing the updates in the right place. Okay, so let's wrap it up with some tips for success. The first thing is get yourself ready, get yourself set for success. And as you're turning in on MRP, or you're getting ready to bring MRP live, you want to make sure you've cleaned it up. Do you have old transactions out there that need to be moved to history? Old sales orders that aren't actually going to be shipped, or they got canceled and you just haven't updated that? Do you have a bunch of lingering back orders on purchase orders that aren't cleaned up? What about active purchase orders, but you just never maintained the dates? Same thing with your sales orders. MRP is going to read all that and it's going to treat it like the truth. So you want to make sure that you're giving it good information. You want the quantities to be updated so that the recommendations it gives you make sense. So the first thing, clean it up. As you're going through that, you'll note that, hey, maybe we haven't been doing this, so we probably should put in place some new business processes around requested ship dates on sales orders, vendor promise dates on purchase orders, canceling out things that aren't going to happen, getting them moved off to history. So update your business processes so that your transactions stay clean. And then give your users a chance for success. Get them on that train. Train them on the business processes, on the windows, on how MRP is looking at that data so that they can keep it set up and running in a way that works for your business. The next thing that I think is a really important thing is to be able to actually get to the data. MRP and GP is largely paperless. We have really good windows to look at. We've got a ton of great information that's in there, but unless the users can get to it in a way that's friendly, it's not going to do them a lot of good. So training is key. And then also it makes sense to get a couple little reports or smart lists written that make that data more accessible. So 2 smart lists that I always recommend is MRP purchasing and MRP manufacturing. And I have put in the slide the friendly name that you use if you build this in Smart List Builder. I also have the technical physical server name. So if you want to write a SQL view or use it in an SSRS report, then you have the data you need for that. The third one isn't quite as easy, but it's an MRP exceptions. So it's one that gives you your move in, your move out, and cancel suggestions. It also gives you everything else that MRP is telling you, like releases within 7 days or the release is past due. but it's got some really, really important stuff in there too, like negative projected available balance. There is an exceptions report that prints at the end of every MRP regeneration, but it can be hundreds of pages long. It is not searchable, and it contains all sorts of information that you don't care about. So the best way to get around that is to write the same data and put it in a smart list. It does require a SQL view because a lot of the flags are in there as integers. I've included the two tables that the data comes from. And then if you're not comfortable writing a SQL view, I do have one that I commonly use. So reach out to me. I have my email at the end of the session, and I'm more than happy to share. You could probably also search online and maybe see if there's something out there. So get that data out there to your users. The next thing is there are just a couple things you can do to keep it running smoothly, to automate it a little bit. So do schedule MRP so that auto regens. It's in the MRP setup. You do have to be logged in as SA because you're going to create a SQL job. It's a relatively friendly window, but you can set MRP up to run every night at midnight or every 4 hours or whatever makes sense for your business and the rhythm of your orders. But get MRP scheduled so that it's going at a pace that their users don't have to do it every time. They can still regenerate if they need to, but if they don't need to regenerate every time, then they can just get right into the system and get to the data without slowing down other processes because you're running MRP all the time. The next thing that can be helpful is if you've got items or sites that shouldn't be planned for MRP or item site combinations that shouldn't be planned, get that data tidied up so that when MRP is running, it's only running against the right data. It keeps the windows cleaner, it makes it run faster, and it keeps less garbage. And then in the idea of keeping things tidy, there are two utilities that you need to run when you first start MRP. And you should probably run occasionally, I don't know if monthly, quarterly, but at some point, just get those running. They're under manufacturing, they're called utilities. There's MRP low-level codes, which calculates where in the bill of material a component resides. And there's MRP exclusions build, and that's just keeping track of what items and sites need to be kept within MRP. And it's keeping that up to date from your item resource planning window. But if you've updated any of those values via a SQL script, then that exclusions build should probably be run so that it can just refresh its data. And it doesn't hurt to run it occasionally just to make sure that everything is keeping in sync. Okay, so we are at the end. If you've been putting questions in the chat, this is when I'm going to come on live and we can talk about anything that you want to talk about. If you've got any comments, then I'm more than happy to address them. If you haven't put chat comments in there or you have a question and you're more comfortable sending me an email, my email address is on the slide and I'm always happy to talk about MRP. I want to say thank you to DynamicsCon for having me on here. Thank you for everyone who voted and gave me a chance to get on here to talk about MRP. It's something that I think is super exciting. I'm passionate about GP, I'm passionate about manufacturing, and I'm always happy to share. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions. Well, hello, everybody. I hope that that was a fun intro to what to do after you turn on MRP in GP manufacturing, and that there was some good information in there to help you move forward and get through any issues that you're experiencing. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but please feel free to put them in the comments. I'm here. I'm ready to answer questions. If it's not something I can answer quickly or it'd make more sense to have a screenshot or something, then you can also send me an email and I will do my very best to answer them. So I'm just going to have a quick look here and see if there are any. I'm super happy that there are people who are here today because I feel like MRP in GP is super usable and it's something that you don't have to be a manufacturer to have. You can also run it if you're just buying and selling and maintaining your inventory. The functionality is still there and it is something that I think could really be helpful. And I'm hoping that people are taking advantage of the functionality. And if you aren't, then this is a really good place to start. If I don't have any questions, I am just going to tell you like a little more piece of information of something that I dealt with actually today. I was working with somebody who has implemented MRP and they're just getting into it. And they are having some issues because they put their order point or their safety stock in a bunch of different levels. And so one fun little thing that we kind of worked through as we're realizing this is that they had their order point on their raw materials and their order point up at the finished good level. And so what MRP was doing, it was really doubling up the supply suggestions for the raw materials, because it was treating order point as 0, which is how MRP reads that field, and planning in addition to the regular sales orders that were coming in for the finished good and accommodating that with MOs. It was then seeing the order point and putting out MO suggestions to satisfy that. And when the buyer was looking at these PO suggestions from MRP, they were so big, but they were big because they had the real demand, they had the inherited demand from the finished good order point, plus the raw material had its own order point that represented a couple weeks of inventory. So it was just exploding into big inventory suggestions. So one of the things we talked about was just the importance of knowing what's on that item resource planning window and make sure that the order point is in a place that makes sense so that you're not doubling up these suggestions to MRP. So that's always kind of a fun thing to realize once you see all those numbers together. And I can see that there are some people who have also dealt with that in the chat. The other thing on order point is to remember that it's not lead time times usage, because MRP is already seeing all the real transactions. It really is what you want it to treat as 0 in addition to all the transactional demand that you're seeing. So in the chat, I'll just read this. This is a question that says, is there a way to automatically offset the in-house due date to a certain number of days before the due date on the header so that MRP brings it in earlier to allow for picking and assembly time? And there is. If you go to the sales setup, so go to the sales module, go to setup, then go to sales order processing. When you open that window, up at the top in the ribbon, there's an additional menu called additional. And when you click on that, the drop-down will provide one that's called manufacturing preferences, manufacturing sales preferences, I think. And in that window, it tells you how you want MRP, or really manufacturing, to interact with the sales orders. And there's a way to put in an in-house date offset. And that offset will then create a little bit of a buffer between your demand on your sales order. So the line items requested ship date might be on a Wednesday. And if you've given it a 2-day offset, then it'll move that forward. So the in-house demand date will actually read as a Wednesday. That's when the MOs will show to be due. And that gives you plenty of time to do your pick, pack, ship operation. So hopefully that will be helpful to you. All right, so while I'm waiting for more questions, another thing that we came across that I didn't really have time to talk about in the video is that sometimes people will use the order point as a way to accommodate variability, which is exactly what it's meant to do. But sometimes people will do that to create a way to, they feel, manage future demand or things that have super short lead times. And the thing that I just want to point out is under manufacturing, the transaction section, there is a place to put in a sales forecast and then enable that sales forecast for MRP with dates. And so when MRP is running against that, it will see in these buckets of time that you have planned sales demand. And then when your sales orders actually come in, it will recognize that that sales order is in the same bucket of time as that forecast demand, and it will net them together. So they don't double up. It will accommodate and see that you have a real sales order, and that's firm demand, and then whatever's remaining is your forecast demand, which is planned, but it nets the two together and feeds that to MRP, but it feeds it to it in a date-sensitive way, so that if you have demand that you don't anticipate until next week or the following week or over the next 6 months, then you have MRP really working at the scheduling function with the date sensitivity that you want. The difference is that order point, if it sees you going below order point, it acts like you've gone below 0, and it acts correspondingly panicked, and it wants you to satisfy that demand right away. Whereas a sales forecast is a little more intuitive because it's working with the sales orders. It's kind of acting like a pre-order idea as far as feeding it off to MRP. And so you get some date sensitivity that you wouldn't normally get if you're dealing just with order point. So I'm just checking the queue to see if there are any more questions. I am really happy to talk about MRP if you have any. All right, if I don't see any more, I'm just gonna let it go for a few more minutes, but while we kind of wait, I just wanna point out a couple quick things. One is that these presentations are gonna be available on the YouTube channel for DynamicsCon, and I think they're gonna be available after March 23rd. So if you want to get to the slideshow or download it or see the video again, then that is gonna be available in about a week, and that will be out there for you. And my email address is in that. So if you think of anything as you're going through and want to reach out, or if you want that SQL script that gives you the exceptions with all the integer values turned human readable, then I can give you that also, so you can incorporate that into your smart list and get that out to your users in a way that would work together. And then the other thing that they wanted just to remind us all is that if you're interested in keeping the chat up, then you can go to the dynamicsuser.net, and so you can continue any conversations and networking that you might have had that you've been doing so far. So I don't see anything else. Thank you so much for attending. I hope you got good stuff out of it. I hope you have a bunch of other sessions that are scheduled and that you enjoy all of your time kind of networking together and seeing all the content that's out there. I want to thank the user group for making this available, and I hope you guys have a great evening. I'll talk to you next time. Have a good one.